Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And today, we're going to talk about genetics and epigenetics. Are we really masters of our fate? You know, we think that we determine what we like, what we don't like. We determine our tastes. We determine our fate. But, well, Mother Nature has a different agenda. Mother Nature, at the genetics level, wants to make sure that we propagate our genes into the next generation. And so this creates a mismatch. So are we really masters of our fate? Once again, we have with us Bill Sullivan. He's a professor of pharmacology and microbiology at Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis. And once again, he's written the delightful book, Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. And so today we'll try to demolish the fact that you are really the master of your fate, the master of your likes and your dislikes. For example, you've probably seen these dating games on TV. You've been on maybe a blind date. And the question is, what determines what you like or don't like in that potential mate? Once again, with us today is Professor Bill Sullivan. So, Bill, once again, tell us, when you were a youth now, when you were a kid, what steered you in the direction of science and eventually biology and finally the genetics of behavior?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back on. Thanks for having me back as a guest. I think my first inspiration would have been my parents. They always encouraged me to be inquisitive. They showered me with all sorts of books that taught me how things work, which was always at the forefront of my mind. And I grew up with idols like Carl Sagan and Bill Nye and later Steve Hawking and yourself to popularize science and energized me even further. As I moved further into biology, thanks to some wonderful teachers, I became enamored with the genetic code and how actually it builds things, how it contains the recipe for life, and never looked back after that. Trying to decipher how DNA makes life work is a real fundamental question to our biology and one that is endlessly fascinating to me.
Okay, well, in your book, which talks about dating, talks about our addictions, talks about psychology, hidden desires, what was perhaps one of the most astonishing or quirky or surprising result that you came across, given the fact that we think we are masters of our fate, and perhaps that's not really true? What did you find looking at our genes and the environment?
That was one of the most surprising things, because when you put all of this information together, we are influenced by a number of things that kind of collaborate. They conspire to bring about our personality and behavior in ways that I couldn't even imagine. I'll give you 4 quick examples. The first is genetics. Now, we all know that genes do things like control our eye color and so on, but they have far-reaching effects into our behavior, some of which can affect even where we lie on the political spectrum or when we lose our virginity. So those were really amazing to me. Then there's the second pillar, which is epigenetics, how our environment regulates those genes, critically important aspect. The third is our microbiome. Very surprising effects are coming out of the research labs that tell us that the microbes in our gut, these trillions of microbes, have influences on our moods and behaviors. And then the fourth one basically stems from subconscious studies and psychology, where our brain is doing a lot of things underneath our conscious level that we're not aware of, and it can prime us to do certain events.
Okay, well, we've had on the show experts on twin studies, twins that were separated at birth, raised in totally different families, socioeconomic families, and then by interviewing them, scientists were astonished at how similar they are and how divergent they are in other directions. So isn't it true that scientists found that roughly on average, about 50% of behavior is actually genetically hardwired in our brain?
Studies from identical twins do seem to suggest that. I've read everything, depending on which trait you're talking about, it can have as little as like a 20% influence, but then some, for like intelligence, a surprisingly high amount seems to be genetically influenced, not controlled, but influenced, upwards of like 80%. So it depends on which aspect of personality people are talking about, but there is no question that genes have an influence. Sometimes that can be, on average, as much as a half, like you said, which means the environment brings in the other half, and that's where we get into the science of epigenetics.
Okay, now, in addition to writing your book, which is called Pleased to Meet Me, you also write articles for Psychology Today and Discover Magazine, and articles that are pretty quirky and go to the heart of who we are and our behavior. So let's just take a few of your articles that you've written for Psychology Today. Several months ago, of course, we had Halloween, and believe it or not, you have an article. Have no fear. Halloween monsters provide a teachable moment. Now, how is that possible?
Right. This is based on a talk called the Monster Mash that I give every year, usually for school children or at libraries, that try to talk about some of the biological origins of monsters. So this is a talk that, especially when I give it for children, I try to teach them that monsters really aren't anything to be afraid of. They are folklore. They're stories that we tell. And I try to I shed some light on the fact that a lot of these stories probably have their origins in real life events. Take vampires, for example, very scary type of creature. But rabies has been connected to vampirism in a number of different ways. The first of which is that rabies makes people aggressive and bite. That's very consistent with the vampire legend. And it's transmissible, so the rabies virus gets transmitted through the bite. And if you're bitten by a vampire, you're also going to become a vampire. And then finally, there's the connection to bats. Vampires switch between humans and bats, and rabies, one of the major vectors for that virus, is in fact bats. So there's some really striking parallels between some diseases and disorders that might make monsters seem like they're real, but there's a biological explanation for it.
Now, isn't it also true that we are disgusted by scenes of lots of junk and debris and lots of trashy things? And that's actually good for us, because if you have a trashy environment with lots of debris, chances are there are germs, bugs, things that are dangerous to us, and we avoid them. So isn't it true that in some sense we may actually be hardwired to like things that are pretty and not like things that are full of debris? You got 10 seconds.
I think you're absolutely right. It goes way back to our evolutionary roots to be hygienic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Bill Sullivan. He's a professor of pharmacology and microbiology at Indiana University, author of the book, Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. So today we're going to shatter the myth that we are masters of our fate. Our likes, our dislikes, who we like, who we don't like, the kind of women, the kind of men that we want for a date. Yes, there are genes that control, to some degree, our behavior. Well, just before the break, we were talking about Halloween monsters. Let me ask you a question that is a little bit of a stretch. Children are afraid of little things like snakes and lizards and crawly things. And if you think about it, we're much bigger than them. So why should we be afraid of them? Now, there's one theory which is kind of a stretch, and that is that we as mammals coexisted with dinosaurs and giant lizards for millions and millions of years, and perhaps there's a remnant of that fear when we were quite small, quite vulnerable to reptiles that were much bigger than us. So what are your thoughts about the fact that our fears may be in some sense genetically influenced?
Well, that's a very interesting theory. I've never heard it quite articulated in that fashion. We certainly do seem to have an inborn fear of snakes or even pieces of rope that look like a snake. So, and I think other primates share this fear. So this does probably stretch way back into our evolution. I don't know how we go about testing how far back it goes, but there certainly seems to be an instinct associated with it. One of the more interesting modern-day experiments that relates to that would be an appearance where mice seem capable of learning a new fear and passing it on to their children, not through a learned or taught activity, but down through the genes in a process called generational epigenetic inheritance. So this is a crazy experiment. They had mice, and they shocked mice whenever they smelled cherries. Mice normally love the smell of cherries, so they developed an unusual fear for them. Now, when these mice had children and even grandchildren, those children and grandchildren were born afraid of cherries, even though they've never been shocked or never saw their parents get shocked. So that's really unusual, where it seems that a fear was inherited through an epigenetic mechanism through multiple generations.
Okay, and also you wrote an article for National Geographic called Why We Like What We Like, a scientist's surprising findings. So we think that what we like is, well, it's our own business, none of your business, and it's just a question of my taste. But you're saying that there are other forces involved in determining what we like. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. This is a fascinating subject to me and probably almost everybody. Why do we like certain foods or beverages? And we can't understand when someone doesn't enjoy what we like at the dinner table. So this is a bit of a puzzle. Turns out that there's a lot of genetics associated with this. So super tasters, for example, these are individuals. They comprise about 25% of the population, individuals who can't tolerate certain bitter foods. So plants, they don't want to be eaten. They make a lot of bitter chemicals in their leaves. So we have variation in the human population. Some people don't detect that bitterness, but some people have a great sensitivity to it. And the reason why is because their brain is kind of tricked into thinking that this is a poisonous plant, it's too bitter, you shouldn't eat it. This phenomenon's been linked to a certain taste bud receptor gene, interestingly enough, called taster. So people like myself who are super tasters have a genetic variation in this gene that builds a taste bud receptor on our tongue and basically binds to those bitter chemicals in a very strong way. So our brain gets the signal that this is probably poisonous, you should spit it out. That's why I hate broccoli. But most people, 75%, don't have this variation in that gene, and these bitter chemicals just kind of float right over their tongue. They don't bind to that taste bud receptor too tightly because that genetic variation introduces a change in the shape of it.
Now, sometimes flipping the dial on TV, I see these contests among taste testers of wine, and I say to myself, come on, how can somebody be so good to differentiate between two different quantities of wine for a contest? And I say, the product of this contest must be fake. I mean, they're not going to agree on what they like and dislike, but what you're saying necessarily so. You're saying that there really could be a genetic basis to people who can detect the slightest variation in things like wine, which of course is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Could you elaborate?
This is a very interesting phenomenon, and I had the same skepticism that you have. I watch these sommeliers or these wine tasters, and I just don't get it, I enjoy wine myself, but I can't pick out all these different complex flavors. So maybe they have genetic variations that allow them to do this, or maybe they're just fooling themselves. There were some interesting studies where this was exposed, where people who profess to be professional wine tasters were given samples of the same exact wine, and they didn't know that, like, all four glasses were the same wine. They were told that they were different, and they ranked the same wine differently, and they gave them different descriptions. So I think you gotta take some of this exquisite wine tasting behavior with a bit of a grain of salt. Another interesting part of this is if these professional wine tasters were given white wine with red food coloring in it, the wine appeared red, but they would describe it as a red wine when in fact it was a white wine. So our brain can be tricked into overriding our taste sensations by what we see visually. So their brain saw a red wine in the glass, even though it was artificially colored, and that kind of fooled them. One final aspect to this that's worth mentioning is there's new studies suggesting that the microbes in our mouth can influence the taste of wine. And this could open up a whole new different arena of research into why some people might be able to exquisitely taste certain flavors and tones in wine where we cannot, because they have different microbes in their mouth.
Okay, now you also wrote an article for Psychology Today magazine, quote, "Why do we love the Big Bang Theory's Sheldon Cooper?" Now, when I watch the Big Bang Theory, I say to myself, well, he's a physicist, Sheldon Cooper, just like me. He works in the same subject as me. He works on string theory. I work on string theory. But none of my friends act like Sheldon Cooper, who is clueless, absolutely clueless when it comes to social interactions. However, you've studied this. So what are your thoughts about, quote, why we like Sheldon Cooper?
Right. And I asked myself the same question. And I know many people in the sciences, biology to physics, who are just really great, but still very empathetic and still in touch with other people's emotions. So I think we're just fascinated by genius as a species. We are fascinated by this. We want to try to understand it. But we also seem to have a desire that we want other people to be empathetic. We want them to be able to feel emotion. And this is one of the complex characteristics that surrounds the figure of Spock in Star Trek lore, or Data in The Next Generation. We have these really, exquisitely intelligent people, but who can't seem to grasp the basic fundamental emotion. And as human beings, we want everybody to feel emotion. I think we actually get afraid of people who cannot feel emotion, because then they become unpredictable. We don't know what they're doing. We can't get into their head as easily because we don't know exactly what they're feeling. So, our feelings are very tightly connected to what we are going to do. And I think if we can't predict what someone is feeling, then we can't predict what sort of behavior they're going to exhibit.
Now, there's something called Asperger syndrome, where people are pretty much devoid of emotional bonding with other people, but they're very good. Some of them are very good analytically. Some scientists believe that Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all time, the man who opened up the universe to mathematics and science, that he suffered from Asperger syndrome. He was somebody that you would not want to invite for dinner, totally incapable of small talk at the dinner table, but he was the greatest scientist who ever lived. So after the break, let's talk a little bit about the Sheldon Coopers of the world. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Bill Sullivan, Professor of Pharmacology and Microbiology at Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis. And we're talking about his latest book, Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. So today, we're going to try to demolish the idea that we are truly masters of what we like and dislike, that our behavior, believe it or not, is influenced by not just the environment, but by genetics. And where we last left off, we were talking about Sheldon Cooper and geniuses. So let me ask you a question. What do scientists think about scientists like Isaac Newton? People that had almost no social skills that we know of, but people who basically probed the secrets of the universe itself. Has that theory held up, that Asperger's syndrome is like that?
I think by and large it does, on average. There's certainly exceptions to the rule, and we see this in the so-called modern savants or modern geniuses of the day. I've heard the same story that you articulated about Isaac Newton, and despite his tremendous genius, yeah, he really wasn't the kind of guy who you wanted to invite over to play cards or to have for dinner. If you look at many of the savants, like one of the most well-known is Rain Man from the famous 1988 movie, that was based on a real figure. His name was Kim Peek. And while he had an extraordinary capacity to remember all sorts of things and dictate them with ease, he had trouble in other areas. he couldn't really button his shirt easily. He generally had a low IQ in other areas, despite the fact that he had this incredible memory, and he had trouble relating to other people. So we see trade-offs. Whenever we see this tremendous enhancement of analytical activity in the brain, we sometimes see a trade-off, and there's other areas of the brain that don't function as they normally would. And many of these relate to how people interact socially or how they respond to stress. But then again, you get other geniuses like Daniel Temmick. He's an autistic savant, and he can cite pi to like 22,000 decimal places. And he seems like a perfectly normal gentleman. There doesn't seem to be anything, that's like a behavioral anomaly associated with his personality. So there's a mix and match of things. One of the other compelling things is what happens in some cases of Alzheimer's. There's a certain area of the brain that seems to shut down in certain forms of dementia. And when we see certain areas of the brain shut down, we sometimes see other areas ramping up. So many Alzheimer's patients will develop or exhibit a brand new talent that just seems to come out of the blue. Like suddenly they'll really get into painting or really get into dancing or something like this. And it's kind of thought to be believed that the other parts of the brain were suppressing those talents and those activities. And when they were dampened, the other ones had the opportunity to flourish. And that's been backed up by science done by Alan Snyder at the University of Sydney.
Now, you mentioned Daniel Tennant, the man who could memorize pi to about 10,000 decimal places. I actually had him on radio, and I asked him, how do you do it? How do you memorize 10,000 digits? And he says, it's very simple. You associate a color with every digit. And then I said, well, how do you memorize 10,000 colors? And he said, well, I don't know. Now, the last time you were here, in your book, Pleased to Meet Me, we also talked about the dating game and how women seem to prefer men who are successful and established, and women, let's take a short commercial break, but after the break, we're going to talk about the dating game and your book, Pleased to Meet Me. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest is Professor Bill Sullivan, author of the book, Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. And if you want to know more about Science Fantastic, go to my website, mkaku.org, mkaku.org. We have 3 million fans on Facebook. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers, and today we're going to talk about, are we really masters of our fate? Well, last time you were on the show, we talked about evolutionary psychology and the dating game, that women subconsciously seem to prefer men who are successful, people with resources, because that could help their children, and you want to propagate your genes into the next generation. That's the whole ball of wax. But for men want women who are healthy. That is, women who could bear children. That means women who have hourglass figures, women with big eyes, and full lips, because they are markers of estrogen circulating in their blood. However, there's some people who say humbug. Some people say, well, take a look at other characteristics. Actual surveys of women show that women like men who have a sense of humor. Now, think about that for a moment. Yes, women do like men with a sense of humor, but what does that have to do with making sure that your genes survive into the next generation? Yes, if you marry a billionaire, chances are your genes are going to survive to the next generation. But what does humor have to do with anything? What are your thoughts?
Well, all those evolutionary psychology theories about attraction between men and women make me a little squeamish. They're really hard to test, and it's really hard to dissociate cultural factors from these theories, meaning that the way we live our lives now may inform how some of those theories developed, and they may not really have any truth attached to them. But as general rules, a lot of people seem to see an appeal in some of these theories. I can speak to the item you raised there with respect to humor. I think people would be attracted to humorous people for a number of reasons. First of which is it's fun to laugh. And, it's an enjoyable activity. Our brain is stimulated by this. So someone who can make you laugh is probably someone who can, you can tolerate. But if someone is being humorous, they also tend to have good intelligence, above average intelligence. So that would be a good sign and probably good for your genetic legacy. And they probably also have an ability to work the social scene. So humorous people know how to, work a crowd. They know how to make people laugh. They tend to be successful in social settings. And we as a social species, it's important to be able to navigate those different social circumstances. So I can see, if I put on my evolutionary psychology glasses, I can kind of see why a sense of humor would have a genetic advantage.
Of course, and then there's also the other objection that, well, yes, some women do like successful rich men. Some men do like pretty, that is, healthy women. But is that testable? I mean, these mating behaviors were formed millions of years ago, going all the way back into our ancient past. We didn't have science back then. We couldn't take a poll. How do you verify any of these theories? Because these theories germinated when we were in the forest.
You raise an excellent point, and that's one of the reasons why those theories make me kind of squeamish, because they're not inherently testable unless we develop some kind of time machine and sail back through the ages and observe this in a true, anthropological setting. So we have to take them with a grain of salt. These are theories and nothing more than that, and we have to go into this with eyes wide open that these theories could have been biased because of the cultural stereotypes that exhibit between men and women today. So we do have to be very careful, as you said, when we entertain some of these ideas that evolutionary psychology puts forth. That's not to say that they should be totally discarded, but it does issue a word of caution when we try to think about these things. And it certainly should not be any sort of indicator whatsoever that that's how we should live our lives now. So even, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say all these theories are true. It certainly doesn't mean that's the way men and women should behave these days.
Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Today we're talking about, well, everything you thought that you were a master of is not really true. There is a subconscious mind, a mind influenced by your genes, a mind that's influenced by the environment, and you're not quite the master of the fate that you thought you were. Once again, the book is called Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. The author is with us today, Professor Bill Sullivan, Professor of Pharmacology and Microbiology at Indiana University. And, Bill, you've written a number of great articles for different magazines. And here's an article that you wrote about science fiction. I'm a fan of science fiction, but you're a biologist. What does a biologist have to do about science fiction? You wrote an article called If the Script for Avengers Infinity War was peer-reviewed. Or what about Star Wars, if Star Wars was peer-reviewed? So what are your thoughts about science fiction?
Well, I love science fiction. It's probably one of the things that got me into science at the get-go. So I enjoy digesting all sorts of different science fiction, from your Star Wars, Star Trek, your Avengers, all this kind of stuff. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. And I enjoy when they try to put in a little bit of intelligent science actually into their plots. But there's also instances where they fail at this, and the science comes across as either pseudoscience or just flat out wrong and inaccurate, and that's a bad message to be sending to audiences, even if it is in the form of fiction, because some people look to this as having an element of truth. So one of the things that my son and I like to do when we go to the movies is afterwards we kind of critique them, and as he was growing up, I would tell him what elements were probably real and grounded in reality, and what elements that there's just no evidence for, or that's a real stretch. And that's where these peer review things come in. So if your audience isn't familiar, what we do as scientists, we write up our research, we submit it to scientific journals, and they are critiqued, very stringently by our peers, and that's what the peer review process is. And it's not an easy process because they're looking for problems in your work. They're looking to falsify it. They want to make sure it's true before it goes out for publication. So it's a necessary but tough process. So my son and I, basing our conversations around this, we critique the movies and then write them up as if it were a peer-reviewed article. So we've had a lot of fun in doing that. I think it was a good learning experience for him, and they've become some of my most popular articles among scientists because they've all been through the peer review process, and they've most likely seen those movies as well. So they've worked out really well.
And any thoughts, any critiques of these things? I've seen all the Avengers and all the Star Wars movies in the saga. Any particular thing that jumps out?
Well, one that sticks in my mind is, you get the usual. Anytime there's a space movie, there's all these sounds that are happening in space, explosions that are happening, and you hear them. The movie theater shakes, and you probably know better than me that that's not really what would happen. And in Star Wars, there was this. I think it was the Last Jedi. There was this famous scene where they used one ship to destroy another by just basically running into it at light speed. And if that was really possible, if they were really going to do this, then why not just get a bunch of droids to pilot other ships and destroy the enemy fleet? Utilizing that strategy. So you get this combination of pseudoscience stuff and just basic plot holes, and you can come up with a peer review quite easily.
Yeah, for example, the rocket ships all bank in outer space in Star Wars. That makes for great cinematics and for heart-thumping scenes, but rockets do not bank in outer space. They obey Newton's third law of motion. They can zigzag, action-reaction, but banking is a consequence of Bernoulli's principle, that is the motion of airfoils in air, and that's why they bank, but rockets do not have to bank. But of course, that's science fiction, and if it thrills the next generation of kids, that's okay with me. One quick question I have here. One quick question I have. You've also wrote an article about parasites, about toxoplasma, about the fact that some parasites actually hijack the behavior of animals to carry out the parasite's wishes, even if it means that the host animal commits suicide. So how does that work? That is so bizarre.
Toxoplasma gondii is a fascinating parasite. So fascinating, I've spent 20 years researching it. And one of the aspects we study in my lab is how behavioral changes take place in animals that become infected. So toxoplasma infects any warm-blooded vertebrate, but it really wants to get into the cat. The cat is what we call a definitive host. It's the only host where the parasite can complete the sexual stage of the life cycle. So it really wants to get into a cat. All the other animals, it just kind of sits in the muscle tissue. It sits in the brain tissue as a dormant cyst. Doesn't kill the host, doesn't make it sick. But evidence now suggests that when these parasite cysts are in the brain, it does something to the immune system that changes the animal's behavior. And this animal loses its fear of predators. So this might look like a bad strategy because no parasite wants to kill its host. But in this case, it is basically telling that host to commit suicide by going into a cat's belly. And that's where the parasite wants to get the most. And even if it's eaten by another creature, it won't be able to complete its sexual cycle, but it'll still be able to propagate itself through another host's body. So fascinating parasite, and we can probably learn a lot about our behavior by studying how the inflammation affects it.
Absolutely amazing. Well, once again, our special guest has been Bill Sullivan. The book is called Pleased to Meet Me, How Genes, Germs, and the Environment Make Us Who We Are. Thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me back.